Hi, good afternoon, and thanks for joining us. My name is Gyure. I'm the Director of Strategy and Offering Management in our IBM Security Group, responsible for our Zero Trust strategy. I'm going to be joined today with Maher, who is our associate partner from our IBM Security Services team focused on identity and access management. In today's session, we're going to walk you through what it means to deliver a Zero Trust strategy, specifically built on an effective identity and access management solution set. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off this presentation. I'm going to walk you through what Zero Trust is and what it means to IBM from our larger sort of point of view, how we can help you. And then Maher's going to jump in and specifically dig down into identity and access management and how we specifically think about Zero Trust within that portfolio. So let's talk about the problems that we're experiencing today. Many of you I know are struggling with this, just like many of the clients that we speak to on a daily basis are. Our environment is changing. The perimeter of our environment is changing. We're all moving to supporting digital transformation, which means that we're supporting hybrid multi-cloud environments. We're moving more applications to the cloud. We're moving more of our data to the cloud. Our users are interacting with our companies in a completely different way than they have in the past. And we have to balance this new IT environment between the operational context of on-premises applications, cloud-delivered applications, and maybe not only in just a singular cloud, but in multiple clouds. And this becomes very challenging for us because what happens from a security perspective is that we lose that complete risk and visibility view, that holistic view of risk and compliance across this really diverse landscape. And oftentimes, the line of business, the application owners, those that we're empowering to actually get out and perform digital transformation for our organizations, they're out in front of us from a security perspective. They're out delivering applications faster than we can deliver the security to make sure that we're managing the risk in our environment. And oftentimes we find ourselves as security practitioners deploying a collection of tools, fragmented tools, things that help solve a particular security problem or a space where we have vulnerabilities that we're trying to manage, but in a way that isn't connected. So what does that mean? It means that our organizations really need a new way to be thinking about how to deploy an effective security strategy. And a lot of organizations are turning to Zero Trust, a strategy that was coined and framed by Forrester research. And it's a strategy that's much more holistic. And we'll talk about what it means, but there's a lot of context and information. And you see that 78% of organizations that have been queried are moving and thinking about Zero Trust as a way to help protect this new landscape that they find themselves in as digital transformation changes. This new normal that we're having to deal with right now, how it exasperates these challenges that we're experiencing and where our data and who's using our data, how they're using our data. And this new strategy helps us to align on how to protect against that. But there's a lot of information out there. There's a lot of information around Zero Trust. There's a lot of, for as many vendors as there are many different sorts of points of views of what Zero Trust really means. And so we wanted to take a few moments to kind of think about what is and are the core tenets of the Zero Trust solution. But I'll first start with the fact that this is a framework. This is a strategy. It's a set of guideposts that really help us think about how to be more effective with our security strategies, with our taking the products that we have, taking the solutions that we have in space, putting those things together and really trying to make sure that we're managing risk and the compliance of our environments across these hybrid multi-cloud landscapes that we find ourselves in. If you start to read through the literature and either vendor documentation or things from different analysts, you'll soon find that there's a lot of breadth, there's a lot of depth to this strategy. And at times that can be very complex. It can be in itself overwhelming. So as IBM, we distilled this down to a sort of 3 core principles that I wanted to walk you through. First and foremost, we believe this is a strategy about establishing least privilege. It's really about making sure that we control with some level of segmentation around data, around identity, around endpoint. We put controls in place to make sure that we are effecting a model of least privilege, only giving access to those who really need it. In order to do that, and what's underlying all this model, context is paramount. And we'll talk more about context and what that means in this presentation, but you have to utilize context from all the different security tools that you have so that you can get to that finer granularity of security controls, policies, and actions that you want to put into place to really give you that model of least privilege. And in order to do all of those things, the last core tenet that you'll see and that you often will read about and hear about in Zero Trust is that it has to be a platform-based model. You can't do this integration without a platform, a way to connect these tools together. And we believe that IBM can help you along this journey, but these three core tenets, least privilege, context, and doing that across the platform of shared and connected siloed tools is going to be absolutely key to you. Now, if we take that one step further, and just to simplify that message, right? What are those guideposts? What is the mantra that we should be following if we want to think about Zero Trust and how to affect better security policy? And that mantra is simply this. It's very easy to remember, and it's very easy for you to rationalize this into your security policy, but it's enabling the right users under the right conditions to have the right access to the right data. Very simple, right? But it does talk to that model of least privilege. It does talk to that model of shared context, because in this notion of right conditions, how do you know that they're using the right, or they're using a device that's compliant to your corporate standards? How do you know that they're connecting from a network that is secure? How do you know that that user has the right governance and access controls in place to access the type of data that they may be accessing? It's embodied in all of those things. So those three core tenets that we talked about, following this particular mantra, really sets the goalposts for how you should be thinking about your security and how you should be aligning this to how you get to better security controls and policies. And like I said, context is absolutely important for this. Context is that sharing of information from one security siloed tool to another. So in the case of things like insider threat, you have many different tools out there that I'm sure you're using as a client as well as we are. Those tools might be data security tools, looking at activity patterns for how your users are using or accessing that particular data. When there are anomalies in how they are accessing that data, or how they're pulling out more records than they typically would, that's a user behavior pattern that should be detected and highlighted. Similarly, when they're using identity and access, if they have failed login attempts, or they're logging in from systems that are unknown or they've never logged in from before, that again is context that could be shared in a broader insider threat use case. When you start to combine those elements of context together from those different and traditional siloed security tools, it gives you a much more comprehensive picture. It allows you to create more adaptive access rules. It allows you to create more fine-grained perimeters around the particular sets of data that your users may be accessing or your applications may be accessing. And it really helps you start to drive out that assumptive risk that you find in your environment. All of that is what Zero Trust challenges us to do. So it's a very effective security model from that perspective. And IBM can help. As we take this a step further and we distill this into a strategy or a platform, there's really four core tenets that we think about when we think about how do you effectively deliver a successful model for Zero Trust. The first is around defining context. This is really about discovering and classifying the different types of resources in your environment based on risk. And then putting those granular resource boundaries in place to separate those resources around roles and duties and responsibilities. Who should have access to these data? Let's set the right policies in place. And we need to do that in a way that shares context between those siloed tools, a way that allows us to create those more fine-grained, granular access patterns. And Maher will come on later and talk to you about how we do that with adaptive access and identity as an example of what we mean by defining context. The next phase is around verifying and enforcing. This is where we want to actually put those controls in place to make data inaccessible unless those very specific conditions are met. Back to our mantra, the right user, and the user is a bit of a broader term. It doesn't have to be a user. A user could be an application. It could be a data access pattern. It could be a third party, or it could be a human being as a particular user, both either a consumer and or an employee. So think of it as a bit of an amorphous term, but making sure that that user has the right access to the data under those right conditions, some of those conditions that we talked about. So this is really around putting those segmentation rules into effect and then enforcing those rules at runtime to give the right user the right access. And we need to do that just in time. We need to make those access decisions based on the information that's readily available at that point in time and around the context that is specifically shared at that point in time. As we move to the right, then we need to resolve incidents. There's going to be times when within this architecture, we find elements of insider threat. We find elements of where we have still assumptive risk or we have elevated risk within our environments that we need to take action on. And so what you need is a set of analytics that are actively looking for risk in your environment. And then you need a set of orchestrated and automated actions that can take effect to account for those particular risks. That could be limiting access in some cases. That could be deploying patches to resolve CVEs or vulnerabilities within your environment that are found. It could be wiping devices or creating new compliance rules. But there needs to be a resolution, and it needs to be not manual, because we don't have time as individual security practitioners to always manually affect rules. And so you do need that orchestrated and automated set of actions that help you resolve those things quickly to continue to have that segmentation that Zero Trust challenges us to have. And finally, there's this phase of analyze and improve. Zero Trust is a journey. It's not a destination. There's not a product that you deploy overnight that is Zero Trust, and as soon as that product is deployed, you have an effective Zero Trust strategy. It is a journey in that you might carve off pieces of your business and specifically look at trying to solve the Zero Trust problem just for that space alone, and then evolving that over time. And so there's this continuous approach at improvement that you'd be looking at, making sure that you have more fine-grained access controls and policies put into effect. Maybe you start with confining access to only compliant devices accessing your network that are enrolled and managed in a unified endpoint management solution set. Over time, you might want to enforce multi-factor authentication, or you might want to enforce different types of access patterns dependent on the types of data that end user is going to try and access from those devices. So if it's personal health information, maybe you don't allow even compliant devices to access that data when they're not, within the perimeter of your networks. You can create these more fine-grained security policies over time, but it's about this continuous improvement model. And so analyze and improve. This process allows you to continually adjust your trust patterns, what you will allow, and help you really get back to that mantra of making sure that you're getting segmentation down to the right conditions for that right access pattern. And this falls across a number of different areas. So if you're familiar with the Forrester Zero Trust model, you will have seen a lot of these sorts of things, but these 4 different phases of how we would roll out pragmatically Zero Trust within your environment, surrounded with that continuous evaluation and improvement that we talked about, really falls across your data, your workloads, your identity, your endpoints, your network. We use and embed analytics and visibility across the board, and we use this orchestration to help resolve those incidents as we move. And so each and every one of these pieces are very important. And we know that as security practitioners, you don't use just one vendor's tools. You're using a collection of tools. In fact, many studies have shown us that a lot of our organizations have deployed over 50 different tools from 48 different vendors. That's a lot of tools. It's a lot of fragmentation. It certainly challenges and puts us into that space of the problem that we talked about at the very beginning of this. But if we break those into these different groupings and then start to think about how we combine those to create those granular policies, that's where we, IBM, can help you. And not only can we help you with a set of products and solutions that we have available and off the shelf and ready for you to use, but we also have world industry leading services. And those services and the services team behind that can help you figure out what's the pragmatic approach. What are the use cases that you're trying to solve? What are your goals and achievements that need to be accomplished within respect to Zero Trust? How did you start? And then how do you continuously improve that environment over time? We have a different set of services, one of which is IBM Security Zero Trust Acceleration Services that will help you get started right away, help you define your success criteria, build a pragmatic model, and help start enforcing that and deploying that within your particular environment. So as IBM, we believe that we have, leading industry products and services. We believe that we have a lot of industry knowledge and global visibility across the different client sets that are using and deploying and looking at Zero Trust as an effective model. And we believe that we can bring this to you as a client, as a team, to help thinking about how you can better improve your security in this hybrid multi-cloud environment. And then we can also think about layering in all of these core capabilities that we have within our with our industry-leading analytics and AI, machine learning toolkits, how we embed those into our solutions in terms of how you can use them for both predictive and statistical analytics-based automations, as well as detecting new risk alerts or threats and being able to automate, orchestrate those actions, really enforcing a model of least privilege at the time of runtime. So very important and very key differentiating pieces that we as IBM offer. And as we think about this, I'm going to transition over to Maher, and he's going to specifically dig into identity and access management and how it fits within this paradigm.
Thank you, Wes. So, as Wes mentioned, and it was a great intro with regards to describing the theory and the concepts behind zero trust. What I'm going to try and do now is give some practical examples of how an identity management capability can support these zero trust principles. And I'll start with describing how IAM fits into IBM's vision of this integrated security platform, right? You can see it's a multidisciplinary approach. There's cloud elements, there's endpoint security, there's network security, there's security orchestration and event management, mobile device security, etc. IAM is a bit of a glue component that really helps to tie all these components together and really allows you to enforce security policies and controls across the wide array of areas within the organization. So what specifically am I talking about? IAM kind of breaks down into three areas: privileged access management, identity governance and administration, and access management. These three areas are primarily around stopping threats by integrating with things like SIM systems, incident response management, and user behavioral analytics. They enhance compliance by tying into data and security and privacy capabilities within the organization. And they also allow you to reduce risk by tying into fraud and endpoint protection systems. And what these integrations allow you to do is really start building off of these core foundational capabilities of privileged access management, identity governance, and access management, and enable some more advanced use cases that will directly support the initiatives that you have underway to implement zero trust framework or zero trust strategy. And what I'm going to be doing is giving an example with IBM Technology, but as Wes mentioned, obviously, technology is not necessarily the be-all and end-all. So let's keep an open mind there. But obviously, as IBM looks at their technology portfolio, especially in the security space, they ensure that interoperability aspect is taken into consideration. So you could say, so what, right? What's the big deal? So what the big deal is, for example, is that user whose credential has been compromised, that is the quickest vector for a malicious actor to gain a foothold within your organization. And this is an example of a kill chain as the various stages of credential compromise and how they go about exfiltrating data. But you can see that integration between IAM and a UBA as well as a SIEM system can help to put in place a capability to detect and prevent some of this capability. Now, this is an example of such a use case. And now I've also included here at the bottom the zero trust principles that are directly supported by each example I'm going to go through here. And in this example, we have IGI, which is IBM's Identity Governance and Analytics tool. We have QRadar, which is our SEM tool. We have Resilient, which is our incident response management. And we have IBM Verify, which is our a mobile-based authenticator platform. And you have a use case here where these tools and capabilities are integrated together in such a fashion that you're now able to enable this more advanced use case. Detection of suspicious anomalous activity through the SIEM system could allow the orchestration of certain events to disable or suspend the person's account, open incident response management tickets through the response management system. That could then trigger out-of-band notifications to the end user, querying whether it was them doing a transaction or trying to log in or whatever the incident was. The user is then able to identify themselves through strong authentication or MFA, so that can be layered in at that point. And then the incident could be closed and the access reactivated if it's determined that it was indeed the user that was behind all that. And some of the zero trust principles supported here are things like, policies are dynamic and looking at multiple different sources. We're always assuming that the network is hostile and that internal and external threats are there at all time as examples. And these principles can apply to whether this is someone coming in from externally or whether this is someone on the internal network. The other example here is our journey towards things like passwordless authentication. As I mentioned before, credential compromise is an area of big concern, and one of the zero trust principles is ensuring that every device and network flow is authenticated. That includes IoT, it also includes users, it also includes things like services and applications. And eliminating passwords, which is a weak link in the chain, definitely helps in that regards. It also allows you to put in place things like key lifecycle management to support IoT authentication. And as we move towards this area of decentralized identity, getting rid of passwords in general will become more and more critical to ensure that the chain of security is maintained throughout. Another example on the digital identity front is this whole notion of adaptive access. Ensuring a proper integration between, in this case, our security access management product and our fraud engine, which is Trusteer, or our EMM product, which is Mass 360, for internal employees. Ensuring that integration is in place allows you to take advantage of more advanced use cases like detecting whether or not a session has been hijacked, whether or not credentials have been compromised, and to ensure that we're not just operating within a silo within IAM, that we're actually leaning on other sources of information to augment our capabilities and actually determining whether or not that is in fact the individual who's accessing the system, but some new actor, and elevating the risk profile of that individual. Another area is essentially consistently enforcing that least privilege concept. This is probably easier said than done, but probably implementing proper roles and getting rid of excess entitlements is a key component of that recipe. That is an aspect of implementing your identity solution, and it directly supports the principles that Wes was describing earlier. And lastly, what I'll go through in terms of an example here is leveraging analytics, right, to help you take advantage of these sources of information like your SIEM systems, other data sources, whether it be identity or otherwise, and feed that or integrate that in with your IGA. So when you're looking at whether or not to reduce the overall entitlement levels, you're taking a wider view than just focusing narrowly on an RBAC model or role-based access, but you're actually taking risk scores into consideration, and you're helping the administrators determine what the right level of access is by taking data elements in from other sources, such as the scene system. For example, if an individual has consistently gotten their password wrong the last number of times, that will elevate their risk score, which might trigger a recertification process, which might help determine whether or not that individual should have that privilege revoked, perhaps. These are some examples worthy of consideration. So, you know, all of this can be a little bit overwhelming, and I understand that, but so the idea here is, where can you get started? IBM, as Wes mentioned, has a number of doors you can walk through on the services side that can be product centric or product agnostic, depending on your preference. From an identity management perspective, we offer an assessment and strategy. That's a good place to start usually, and that can be tailored to your needs. From a zero trust perspective, there's also an assessment and strategy offering that can be a good place to start. A third door you may want to choose to walk through, depending on the situation you're in, and we understand COVID has certainly accelerated some of these timelines, is if there's a specific use case or a specific community or a specific part of the organization you want to enable on zero trust and you want an accelerated pathway, then there's another offering here that I'm going to describe, which is a Security Garage. It's essentially an offering that allows you to go from a framing session to all the way to a production build out in probably a time frame of weeks rather than months or years, depending on the size and scope of your MVP. There's a great methodology that we follow as part of this. It's a multidisciplinary approach, and given that zero trust is a multidisciplinary capability, this framework fits quite nicely. As an example, right, we have a use case here whereby your customer might want to build a blueprint or a baseline architecture in the cloud for compliant workloads, maybe a specific application in mind, etc. We would guide that. We would do things like co-creations, co-executions, working directly with the client, bringing in subject matter experts as needed across our security portfolio and services to help ensure that outcome. And at the end of it, you essentially get either a production pilot or a production service, depending on what you originally scoped out. So that's a good opportunity to explore with IBM Garage if you weren't already aware of it. So if you're interested in learning more, we've included some links here that you can go to. Either if you want to know more about Zero Trust, visit the Zero Trust area here, or if you want to learn about IAM, there's a link to our Identity Access Management Services offerings. And if you want to learn more about Garage, there's a link to our Garage offerings as well. We thank you very much for your time, and I'll open the floor for questions.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Maher and Wesley. We have a couple of questions that have come in, some through the session, and we've had one from social media. So I'll just go through these here. The first question asks, as the world gets more inclined towards AI and data science due to increased automation, how will we be able to effectively entrust computers with access management?
That could probably be taken by either of us. Do you want to take a crack at it, Wes, and I'll round it out?
Yeah, I think I'll take the broad brush approach, and then you can come back with the access management piece of
Sounds
it.
good.
I do think that I think it's a great question, and it's an interesting question, right? But if you think about going back to that mantra that I talked about, enabling the right user under the right conditions to have the right access to the right data, and we use those terms in a bit of an amorphous fashion. Users could be applications, and those applications share and have context, right? They have certain IP ranges or networks that they're accessing from. They have a set of behavioristic patterns that they follow when they access those different pieces of data or data structures. And so as you start to use machine learning and analytics to detect those patterns, to learn those patterns and those, whether it's the patterns of access from different locations, or whether it's access, or it's the way that they're actually using the data. What are they searching on? What are they bringing back from those searches? How are they updating that information? And in what order? You can use machine learning to help build out all of those, and then use that to help detect anomalies and potential risks or vulnerabilities. As with anything with machine learning and analytics, we strive for accuracy, right? We strive to get to a perspective where you have very specific accuracy around, is this really an incident or something else, right? But those machine learning algorithms have to grow over time, and they have to get trained over time for specific patterns. And I find it interesting, and maybe I'll round out with this conversation, with the fact that when we all transitioned to working at home, those patterns completely changed. There were different access patterns that never happened before. And so there were a lot of potential incidents of compromise that were being flagged that were not true incidents, right? And so the machine learning had to pick back up. And so patterns will change over time. Machine learning will have to continue to grow. But I think that's all important, because you take all of those pieces of context together to help look at and think about, what are the right access patterns, and how do we make sure that the right people have access to the right data at the right time?
Yeah,
so that's the way I particularly see that.
That's absolutely a great answer, Wes. I don't know if I can beat that, but what I'll do is I'll focus more specifically on the topic of machine algorithms and access management. And what we typically do in the identity space is try and leverage machine learning and algorithms, not necessarily in the process of granting access, but in the process of determining risk and helping craft policies around using that risk score to determine whether or not certain thresholds have been met to start leveling off or taking away some access, at least temporarily, until a human can investigate that. We can use a machine learning to advise a human as to whether or not access should be taken away, or whether or not it should be granted, based on things like peer group analysis, or based on things like a risk score again. But we typically don't let the machines kind of have the final say. Usually it's a human that's either crafting the policy based on risk, or actually performing the granting or removal of access.
Perfect, thank you. So I'll ask this question next, because I feel like it'll be related. What are some key and immediate steps that SMEs can take to effectively integrate access management in their organization?
Wow. So if and this obviously is probably dependent on where an organization would be in their journey, right? Because obviously, if you're trying to do something like Zero Trust, or you're trying to implement a cohesive identity and access management strategy, things have to be executed in a certain order and by a certain priority. So depending on where the organization is in that journey, would determine what key things you can do. Obviously, you want to start putting in place your foundational capabilities first. If you haven't already done so, privileged access management is probably a key place to start, followed by some kind of access management capability to ensure the lack of siloness across your various systems, to remove all those silos. Then followed by your identity governance administration solution. I've typically do it in that order. Or you can do it in parallel if you got the bandwidth. Then you can start doing the more advanced use cases by starting to integrate in with the other systems and the other security capabilities.
Okay, I have a question here. IAM is involved with SIEM. I was just curious if it can be involved with NIST and GDPR as well.
The answer is yes, and obviously, I'll talk about NIST first. NIST offers a wide variety of standards and guidelines. If you haven't already done so, you familiarize yourself with the NIST 800 and the special publication NIST 863 for guidelines for digital identity. Those cover off, ID proofing, identity management, federation, credential assurance, strengths, etc. So that'd be a good place to start. GDPR for sure, because it touches on privacy and consent. We didn't really talk about that too much in the context of zero trust. It's obviously an important topic, but that's where the tie-in with GDPR would be.
Perfect. And we have the question that came through on social media. When it comes to healthcare, what are the most common mistakes that are made? And what are some simple steps that can be implemented right away to mitigate?
Perfect. That's a great question. So Wes, why don't you talk about zero trust as it pertains to healthcare, and I'll round it out from an IAM perspective.
Sure. I think one of the biggest challenges in general, and it's not necessarily just healthcare, but it's what we hear from clients who are working with and thinking about zero trust is that zero trust is a model that was actually coined about over 10 years ago, right? And it was really thought of to be around network segmentation. And so there's this element of segmentation that we talked about today that's still very relevant. But oftentimes when people approach zero trust, they think about network segmentation in general. And so, they lead with that as the solution that they're trying to solve when it comes to a context of how they apply a zero trust model effectively within their environment. What I think is different between the old terminology of zero trust and what you see today when you look at the zero trust extended framework from Forrester. What's at the core of that solution is your data, and then the access patterns and the people who are accessing that data. With healthcare in particular, and the regulation that's within around the data that you hold as healthcare providers, a lot of that is very sensitive information. It's information that you simply can't allow not to be protected, not to have the right governance patterns and access patterns and protection around, so that it doesn't fall into the wrong hands. Imagine, the backlash and the brand tarnish that you would have if that sort of data got out from the healthcare provider. So I think if you start to think about those key core critical pieces of information that you as a healthcare organization are and have control over, do you have the right protection in place? Do you have the right access patterns? Do you have the right access governance rules around it? And are you actively monitoring access into those to make sure that that data is protected, whether it's within or without your perimeter? So do you have those right segmentation rules around it as it starts? So I think that's a good way to start. Of course, you will grow over time, but I think that's an effective way to think about maybe how to start with zero trust.
Yeah, thanks, Wes. And I think that accentuates the point I guess I want to make about the whole healthcare space is I think one of the things people often underestimate is the complexity of the healthcare space in terms of identity and access management in general. It's a quite complicated problem set to solve. You're dealing with doctors and nurses that potentially move around from location to location. You're dealing with labs that process the health testing. You're dealing with results. You're dealing with the data in all those systems, which can be non-uniform and non-standardized. Doctors' offices, individual doctors' offices, which have filing cabinets under their desks and paper records. And you're also dealing with the citizens and the health consumers, right? So it's a fairly complicated ecosystem. A lot of it is governed by legislation that has to be strictly adhered to. It has to be driven by consent driven processes by the end user as to who can get access to what data under what conditions and under what duration of time. Along with liability models have to be sorted out. So it's a complicated space to try and tackle from an IM perspective. Certainly requires a framework to operate in. I know in Canada we have various initiatives, whether it be federal or provincial, that are underway to look at modernizing our health systems. IBM certainly participating in those conversations at the provincial and federal levels, and we're all about working in a part of a larger ecosystem in a open, collaborative way that supports open standards. And we think that that's the way to really solve some of these problems as the space continues to evolve.
Thank you so much. That brings us to the end of the questions. So I'll throw it back to both of you just for some closing remarks.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Just so that you, as participants, know, Maher and myself will be at the IBM booth from 3 to 4 this afternoon, so just an hour from now. So if you have more questions and you'd like to come visit, and we'll be there at the booth, please join us digitally, and we'll answer all the questions that we can. Otherwise, we encourage you to learn more about Zero Trust and how IBM can help you. Thank you.
Yep. Thank you very much. I couldn't have said it better myself.